Welcome back to our webinar series and podcast, Advice from Your Advocates. I'm Bob Mannor, the host and founder of Mannor Law Group. And today we have a guest with us, Lisa Church from Alternative Elderly Care. And behind the camera, we have our executive director at Mannor Law Office, Savannah Metzko. And so she's going to be sort of the voice behind the camera that you might hear. But
hello, voice behind the camera.
So this is our continuing conversation about all the things related to different things that seniors and their families have to deal with and learn, and especially as it comes down to when there is an issue of long-term care or dementia or Alzheimer's and those types of things. And so we realize that we have so many friends and colleagues that have such great experience and knowledge of having dealt with this through the years and helping families. And so often we see when it comes to families, they just really don't know what to expect when it comes to these types of transitions. And when it comes to the other professionals, we see our little slice of the pie. I think, Lisa, you'd probably agree with that we see our perspective, but there's a lot of different perspectives from the standpoint of, in a skilled care setting or independent living setting or, a live-in setting. So it's one of the things I just wanted to say hi, Lisa, to start off with and have you introduce yourself for a second, and then we'll get right into the topic of that transition. Once a spouse or a loved one goes into the hospital and the hospital says, well, you're going to need some continuing care, and what that transition looks like and some of the things that we have to think about.
Thank you for having me today. So for those of you that don't know, my name is Lisa Church and I am the administrator at Alternative Elderly Care. We are a privately owned independent at-home care company right here in Genesee County is where we're located.
I want to get a little bit more into the details about alternative elderly care in a second, but Lisa, I'd like to start off with some of the thoughts and some of the issues that families have to go through and sort of grapple with when I see two big times that there's this transition, and we'll take them one at a time. But the first one is that there's something that happens, a fall, some kind of emergent issue where they go to the hospital and the hospital says, okay, it's time to go home. But either the family or the medical staff say, but you can't really just go home alone. You need more help than that. Or the second one, which we'll deal with in a second question, is they go to some kind of rehab setting first and then go home. But let's start with that first transition home, whether it was a fall, whether it was some other issue, even a stroke, something like that, where they go to the hospital and now the family, for the often first time or never really having dealt with this before, realizes that mom can't just go home and resume her normal life. So what are some of the struggles that families are dealing with, and what's been your experience in sort of helping families through that transition?
So the biggest struggle is always and has always been is the resistance to have, the need for help. And that's a conversation that we have on a regular basis with families as they're bringing loved ones home. The biggest thing that we try to express and implement is if the need for 24-hour care isn't there and it is, a recovery from a fall, maybe somebody checking in on a regular basis, if it's safe for the person to start with smaller hours in one person to get used to the fact of having somebody there to help. A lot of times our clients and families view us as part of the family coming in, and taking on that role that families do so often.
What do you think are some of the emotions? Because I have opinions about this, as you might know. There's some of the emotions that families are dealing with when there is that. So, it could have gone from everything seemed good and we just visit mom, a couple times a month or maybe even every day, but everything's fine, to realizing that everything is is different. And now we really do have to step up and change things. And sometimes, change whether mom's driving to the grocery store or, those types of things. So what do you think, what is your experience as the emotions and the different factors that the family is dealing with and trying to adjust to that new reality?
So for those of us that aren't in the field, because we deal with it on a regular basis, fear is always at the very top of that list. Fear of, a stranger coming in and taking over, fear of, something happening that shouldn't be happening, fear of things getting worse, and fear of the unknown. Especially if there is an Alzheimer's or dementia diagnosis in there. It is a constantly changing environment, and most people that aren't in our field don't know how to adapt to that. The second we see, honestly, is anger. And I think it is relative to the fear because they don't know how to handle it. And because they don't know how, it becomes very frustrating and overwhelming very fast.
That's actually a really good point. And I liked how you phrased that. I hadn't actually thought of it as fear so much. I've looked at it, and I tend to be very blunt with my clients and their families because I am trying to get them to have a plan. And that's where it can be very difficult to have a plan if you have these emotions. And I've always said some of the emotion is sort of, the big one is denial. Denial that life is now going to change for their loved one, for their parent, maybe even for themselves, based on the circumstances. And then part of it, and this is a tough one to bring up, and people don't like to acknowledge it, but it's guilt. And I hate this one, honestly, because I feel like it's guilt that is built by our culture to say, oh, well, we don't need help from anybody. We don't need strangers coming into the house, and not that they'd be strangers for long, but that there's this guilt to say, oh, well, I should take this burden on all myself. It's my mom. And so, even though I have kids and I've got, sports and I've got a job and I've got 100 million things I feel guilty for not just dropping everything and providing that care and getting through some of those mental decisions to say, okay, no, it's not a problem to ask for help. And when mom and dad saved for a rainy day, this was the rainy day they were talking about.
Right.
So how have you helped families through that sort of mental process?
The biggest is the constant reminder that we are all just doing the best we can. And in relating our experience over the last 20 years, that caregiver burnout is very real. It's absolutely okay. And we want families to be as involved as possible. But too often we are the call for a family member that is completely burnout and they need somebody yesterday. And that's the position we try to keep families out of.
I think, and I'm sure you're going to agree with me on this, but I want you to put it in your own words about how much there is a misunderstanding or just a lack of acknowledgement about how difficult it is to care for someone, and especially if it's your loved one. And so if it was your mom or your dad and let's say they're incontinent, well, that can be a whole level of embarrassment and just, trying to handle those situations and at the level of how difficult it is. I think sometimes families don't realize the value of those home care services that you guys offer.
Well, and it's hard to see it from the outside when you're so stuck in that on a constant basis. It's just easy to see that the next task in front of you is going to be the task before the next task. And it's never ending. There's no end in sight to that without help. And it becomes extremely overwhelming.
One of the things, this is probably the most common thing, and sometimes it comes from the spouse, and as often it comes from the kids, which is Mom's already always taking care of dad. Dad's always taking care of mom. Yes, they're 86 years old and they have their own physical ailments and things like that. But putting all of that burden on the spouse, or not all of it, the family, sometimes, like I say just before, the family doesn't understand what of a burden it is, but basically putting most of the caregiving responsibility on that elderly spouse, because, well, they've always taken care of them before, why can't we do it now?
Mhm. And the even harder part is that spouse doesn't want to stop.
Right.
We experienced that. I checked a voicemail before I got on the Zoom meeting from a family whose loved ones are in their 80s, and mom is pushing dad in a wheelchair, and she can barely walk herself without a walker. And that creates a very dangerous environment, not just for the spouse, but for the caregiver. And too often, we've learned to become, unfortunately, blunt in our industry.
Yes.
Because we see spouses go before because of the caregiver burnout, because they are trying so hard to continue to do it themselves because they feel it's their obligation.
I'm glad you brought that up. And a lot of us that are probably listening may have heard this statistic before, but it's absolutely true. We see it all the time. I'm sure you see it all the time, that the caregiver spouse, what the so-called healthier spouse, dies first most of the time. And I can tell you from a legal and financial perspective, that throws a huge monkey wrench into the planning. We have, so fewer options if we haven't planned for that. Most people's legal documents haven't contemplated that the healthier spouse is going to die first. And I imagine it throws all kinds of, issues for the caregiving part of it.
It does.
One of the things that we've seen that kind of goes towards the same is, and I say this a little bit tongue in cheek, but I've just seen it too many times not to recognize it as a reality, and we call it the Siegel effect. And here's what I mean by the Siegel effect. You probably heard me tell this joke before, but the Siegel effect is the out-of-town relative that flies in because mom fell or whatever. And what do seagulls do? They poop all over everything and then fly out of town. And so we see this all the time, where the out-of-town relative that doesn't understand how serious this is, how important it is. Mm-hmm. And then they're just very, very insistent, sometimes that they're in charge, even though they're in Florida or Texas or something. And number two is, they don't need any caregivers. They don't need any outside help. We don't need to have a plan for this because dad can just take care of mom. And they only see it for that short period of time, that they've been in town, and then they fly out of town.
Yeah. Well, and we see it on both ends, where they come in and get everything in place and order everything that may not even be needed, and then get up and leave. And then we're rearranging because it may have been a short stint, recovering from a surgery, a short-term need for that help that now has become this completely out of control thing that now we have to minimize and collect the pieces after they leave.
Yeah. You raise a good point that I think, and this is kind of sort of a certain personality type of someone that has to come in and fix things. And so they want to get everything. We're frequently dealing with families, and I try to get them, like you mentioned a minute ago, about taking things one step at a time. Okay, we have a crisis we have to solve right now. We have to kind of calm down the crisis. We got to get control and access to things. And yes, we have to talk about what's going to happen in 6 months, and what's going to happen if people die in the wrong order, and what's going to happen if we eventually have to move out of the house. And we have to talk about all of those things, but we got to take the first step. There's the emergency step first. And there is a certain personality type that really have a hard time with that. So they want to order the hospital bed. They want to, do all of these things. And when we don't even know if those are necessary, or those are going to be helpful. I mean, have you seen that before, where we order a bunch of equipment or hospital bed, things like that, and it turns out they never really even use the hospital bed?
Yeah, once or twice, and then we are left to pick up all those pieces and make sure everything gets, sent back or resolved or cut off or all of that. And
I think
it's best intentions in mind. It's always
absolutely.
best intentions.
Yeah, absolutely right. And, what I find is, so one of the services that we offer, I think that you've heard of before, is we offer sort of ongoing assistance with decision making. And one of the big things that we have to do is, and for some families, is kind of slow them down and say, hey, let's take this one step at a time. Let's look at it. Okay, let's get something in place now. We're going home. We're going to end up, seeing how things go. But let's not decide everything until we actually got home and we see how it works in person, and whether there's a wandering issue, and do we need somebody there at night? How often do we need the caregiver there? Some of those things we can't tell until we're there, right? Until you're in the house.
And that's the biggest thing that we see with people transitioning from the hospital directly home, is that their level of care they're receiving at the hospital dramatically changes when they get home, whether it's for the better or the worse. And to make that evaluation at the hospital can be very difficult, because I know when I'm in the hospital, I don't know about you, I am a completely different person than when I get home.
Right. Yeah. And, just want to get home. I mean, that's one of the, no matter what, I just want to get out of here kind of a thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah. One of the things that I think repeatedly, we have families that have a lot of confusion about this. And, this is where everybody in the industry kind of has their own slice, and we get used to sort of explaining these things and not realizing how that it's heard by other areas. And so one of the things I hear, especially coming from the hospital and sometimes coming from rehab, is, oh, you'll get continuing care because under Medicare, you'll still have some rehab continuing, and they'll come out to the house. What I believe families are hearing from that, and what they're sort of expressing to me when I read between the lines and ask them further questions, they imagine they're getting you under Medicare. They imagine they're getting home care, and because they're told, oh, you'll get people that'll come into the house. And what they don't realize is those people might be in the house for 20 minutes or 15 minutes to take blood pressure, or to do whatever, maybe do some physical therapy or things like that. But they're not there as a caregiver to help them get dressed and help them get showered necessarily, and things like that, right?
Yep. And that's when we get the phone call like, okay, well, I have somebody coming 3 times a week, but they're here for 45 minutes and I need help with my groceries, or I need help with, my taking my trash out or running errands, or if they don't have a bath aid, they need shower assistance because they're just getting physical therapy. But it's a huge misconception that I don't think gets explained enough to families. And then it causes a pitfall when they get home, because they're expecting this wide variety of services available to them, and now they're scrambling.
You mentioned something earlier and about, starting out with a certain number of hours and then maybe increasing as we need it. I think depending on the circumstances, and that's the reality here, is everybody's circumstances are different, and there's not one right answer, unfortunately, with this transition home. But sometimes what I recommended is, let's start off with more. Sometimes I've said, let's start off with 24-hour care if we can find the caregivers to do it, because that first transition home is going to be really important, getting readjusted to how we're going to live in our home setting. And then maybe we can scale back the level of care. Is that something that you've seen families grapple with, to say, okay, well, we're just going to do the minimalist level of care, but then they really struggle with that actual physical and logistical transition from getting someone to the hospital to home and getting their prescriptions and getting them all set up properly?
Yeah, and we do, and it's been amazing over the years to see different transitions, because more often than not, agencies like us, people like us, we start with, somebody who may be fairly independent, and then work their way, through the decline, and start adding more days and hours and times. And I've had the pleasure of seeing somebody come home who was never supposed to recover on 24/7 care.
Right.
And over the course of 7 years, we got him down to 3 hours, 3 days a week.
Yeah.
Those are the blessings. Those are the cases that we get to, really rejoice to see somebody recover.
Yeah. And the reality is those transitions actually make all the difference. People, I think, appreciate, undervalue how important that process of moving from one setting to the next setting, to do that as smoothly as possible. You just kind of reminded me of a couple of cases that we had where they were pretty much advised by anybody that they asked that the spouse in this particular case was going to be in a nursing home, skilled care, full nursing home for the rest of their lives. And and then a year later, I have them sit in my office having a full conversation, thanking us for making sure that didn't happen. And I think a lot of it is that transition. We talk a lot about people who have dementia, but sometimes it's a delirium, which delirium can come about, as you know, from the experiences that we're having, from the trauma of going from one setting to the next, especially if we already have some confusion and now we're put into a different setting, and now we come back and all our furniture is moved, and there's new people there, and just smoothing and easing that transition can sometimes result in people being able to kind of readjust themselves and not experience so much of that delirium. Because if it goes into that delirium stage and we never get out of it, then there's a pretty good chance that we're going to need 24-hour care for the rest of our life. But if we can smooth those transitions and minimize that shock to the system, that delirium, sometimes that can make a big difference about the quality of life for the remaining years that they have.
Oh, absolutely.
It's something that I appreciate about alternative elderly care. I know that's one of the things that you guys have helped a lot of folks through, is when given the opportunity that you were able to sort of help them adjust to the new situation that they're going to be facing. And like you said a minute ago, kind of sometimes actually wean them off of that so that they can be more independent.
Yep, and that's our whole goal, is to keep them as independent as possible. It's always been one of our primary purposes. Is, we're there for the 24/7. We work through hospice, but we want people to thrive independently as long as they can in a safe setting. And for most people, that is home. It's not for everybody.
Right. That's true. And that's one of the things that we struggle with sometimes too, is that, and I'm sure, in fact, I know because you guys have sent us folks that you're working with. And one of the things I really appreciate about professionals, when professionals can realize that the service that they're offering isn't a good fit anymore for this particular, patient or client. And I've experienced that with alternative elderly care a number of times, where you were doing well, they were doing well, you were getting services in the home, and they got to the point where you helped the family come around to the idea that, okay, it's probably time now to explore other options. And that's against your own personal interest. And for professionals to do that and say, okay, we're looking out for the best interest for this person, for this senior, and not, what can we get for our agency, and can we get another dollar or another hour of service? And I very much appreciate that about alternative elderly care and the experiences that I've had with them. One of the things I wanted to do is have you talk a little bit about alternative and how you came about. You mentioned that you're independent, and that's there's great bigger companies out there, and there's great family-owned companies. And I kind of wanted you to tell us your story about how you came to be. I know you work with your mom, I believe, and so how did that all come about?
So 20 years ago this February, my mom, seeing that in the home care industry, it was very small and it was very limited. And at the time, my great grandmother, her grandmother needed care, and she wasn't happy with the choices that were out there. So she made a decision and she never looked back. We've always strived to treat our clients like we would my great grandmother and my grandmother that passed 5 years ago. And I tell families when I sit down and meet with them that, you will receive no less care than my own grandmother. And I stand by that. We strive to remain independent and family owned because we believe it makes our quality of care that much better. We are very hands-on with our workers and our clients to ensure that the full circle of care is there, because that's highly important. And especially in the topic we're talking about today, any transition, whether it's hospital to home, rehab to home, home to nursing home, that communication and circle of care is extremely important. And when you have 20 people you're talking to and everybody has a different version of that story, balls get dropped, and we don't like that. So I started working for my mom when I was 17 as a home health aide. Nice. And I took care of my first client for 2.5 years, all the way through hospice. And I tell people all the time, if he was 75 years younger, I would have married him, because he was the most amazing man I'd ever met. And that's what, as far as caregivers becoming family, I worked with him more. We did 24-hour care. I seen him more than my family and my friends. And he was very instrumental in who I am today. And this was 13 years ago. And so I continued to build on that, and I started learning, after my mom in the trade, and I've been her administrator for, I want to say, about 8 years now.
I think that's one of the nice things about sort of a family business is that we often will hear about families, and this comes up, and I know that, you've had to deal with it, where we all know, the family knows, the kids know, everybody knows that mom and dad or whoever is in the house, that they need some assistance, that they need some help, and they can't just do it alone anymore. And yet, when somebody comes to the house, they're like, I don't want this stranger in my house. Now, what I get, my point on it is that they won't be a stranger for long. That's kind of the based on the story that you were telling, that they're not going to be a stranger for long, and there has to be sort of that mission, I guess, of an understanding that sometimes you just have to push through it and say, okay, Mr. Smith, I understand, but we're just going to come and tidy up a little bit, or do whatever it is to make sure that you start establishing that relationship, so that we're not having, and sometimes it's a family that maybe they have some memory issues, or they're just stubborn or whatever, but the idea persists. And so sometimes I hear families, and it kind of drives me crazy. They say, well, we tried home care, but mom and dad kicked them out on the first day. Okay. Well, what about the second day? What about the third day? What about the fourth? And I get there are probably times where you got to just, you got to do what you do. But I think one of the nice things about sort of that family experience is that knowing that you have to sort of establish that relationship of, yes, of course, nobody would want a stranger coming into their house on a regular basis, but you don't have to be a stranger for very long.
Well, and that's, it's being committed to seeing them through that process and understanding that not everybody is a good fit for everyone. And that's just, it's the reality. And even over time, they may start off with a caregiver for a year that's a great fit. If there's Alzheimer's and dementia, things start changing. Sometimes we have to make transitions. Is one of the wonderful things I tell people all the time when they're working with us in the office. If you know Bonnie, if you know my mom, me and her are two completely different personalities, and clients take to one or the other. So it's that personal touch makes a huge difference for a lot of our people.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to talk about a couple other things about sort of that transition to care. I would hope that it's a little bit easier for families to get their head wrapped around it when they're transitioning from a rehab center, so that they're at the hospital, they go for occupational physical therapy at one of those nursing homes or rehab centers. Hopefully the family has a little bit more time to wrap their head around it, and hopefully they're getting a little bit more guidance from social workers and things like that. I understand the pressure on hospitals to get people out of the hospital. And so sometimes it's probably it just happens so quickly that families are really just their heads spinning. So I'm hoping, and I know this doesn't always happen this way, but I'm hoping that there's a little bit more of an opportunity for families to recognize and meet with you and kind of get a feel for things when they're transitioning out of a rehab center or nursing home back home. Am I accurate in that description?
Absolutely. And especially with clients who may have experienced a fall and go to the hospital, they're usually only admitted for 48 to 72 hours if there's nothing major, but then they're told you need 24-hour care going home. And sometimes the family hasn't even had time to go see them yet, or given the last 2 years, weren't allowed to go see them.
Right.
That posed a whole lot of problems. But most people that go to rehab after a hospital stay, they're being observed by their physical therapist, occupational therapists, and social workers for 4 to 6 weeks. We work very closely with most of the rehabs in Genesee County or skilled nursing facilities, and have that open line, back to that full circle of care, open line of communication, and get that feedback as it transitions. So that way, when they are discharged, everything is in place and the transition becomes almost seamless.
One of the things that I see sometimes is, whether it be, and I'll be honest with you, sometimes I think it comes from the family, and sometimes I think it comes from the staff at the hospital, as to whether or not they should accept rehab or go into rehab for some period of time before they go home. Now, the family one is fairly obvious what the motivations are, which is that they are the fear that you mentioned, the fear of going into a rehab. Boy, I told my mom she'd never go to a nursing home. Okay, but if she goes there for 2 weeks, it gets us a chance to get a little stronger, to have some physical therapy, to kind of get things straight, get the house situated, get home care set up, but that's where sort of that guilt and fear come in, where families they're offered rehab and they say no. And I strongly encourage, if you're offered rehab, except maybe in the most extreme circumstances like a lockdown with COVID or something like that, I think that most families are going to be better off going through that rehab process first, rather than coming directly home from the hospital and then trying to figure everything out.
Well, and again, explaining that trauma can be caused if they choose to go home against medical advice. Mm-hmm. And we've seen it happen, even with COVID, because people were scared to send their families to rehab because of lockdowns and protocols and, all of that. And they come home, and within 24 to 32 hours, they may have just went to the hospital for a fall where they didn't break anything, and now they have a fractured hip.
Yeah.
They fell again because they were not ready to come home. And that harsh reality, it's scary.
With regard to the hospital, and again, I accept that everybody's doing their best, and this is a challenging field, and they're getting pressure from Medicare and Blue Cross and everybody else to get them out of the hospital. And so I get how much, this is a difficult job, but I think there are probably two things that sort of lead towards pushing the person or pushing the family to take the person home before they're really ready to go home, and having them set up home care and things like that. One is either the reality or the belief that the insurance company isn't going to authorize rehab. And so sometimes I feel like it's more of a perception, And sometimes I think that it's actually the insurance company, but insurance companies, you can push back on. And so that's why I don't like that perception, because I don't think we've tried hard enough to get the insurance company to authorize going to rehab. We need to push harder. And, that's why lawyers exist, I guess. But, there's some pressure that we can put on them. The other thing, and this is, again, I get it. It's a very difficult job, but sometimes because it's a hard placement. And what do I mean by a hard placement? Someone that maybe has experienced some, they call it behavioral issues, right? Where because of their dementia, because of maybe, the way their brain is not understanding the things that are going on around them, they appear aggressive or they lash out and things like that. Well, if it's in the medical record, that's a difficult placement. Not every place is going to take them for rehab. And so it's harder to find that placement. And sometimes I feel like the hospital is saying, well, just take them home then. Well, if the, 3 hour, if a 3-shift, 24-hour a day, massive medical complex can't deal with this person, how is grandma going to deal with them?
Exactly.
And frankly, a good portion of the time that can be dealt with if we deal with these transitions. In other words, let's get to rehab. Let's work with the medicines and figure out what medication is appropriate. Let's figure out what time of day, if this is only happening at 10 p.m., those types of things. But, even to send them home in that situation, the home care agency is going to have a hard time dealing with it unless we've already kind of smoothed that out and transitioned properly so that we could figure out some of the details. What are the triggers that are causing this aggression? We can deal with that, but sometimes we need to have that sort of slow transition back home.
Well, and like you mentioned earlier, especially if somebody has delirium in the hospital, if it's not related to Alzheimer's and dementia, and the time isn't taken to oversee that person and really understand it, and we've seen it, it's been as simple as a UTI infection, that cleared up with antibiotics. The person was having hallucinations and put red labeled and, had to have a sitter at the hospital. They got antibiotics and were able to go home with minimal care. It's making sure that the quality of care is there for the people that are transitioning and to make their transition safe.
I'm going to circle back to one of the issues that you covered earlier, which was, when we have a married couple and, they keep taking care of each other. And so I've referenced this, I've heard other people reference it, and I'm saying it lovingly, is the two halves make a whole. And what do I mean by the two halves make a whole is that we have one spouse that has significant memory issues and the other spouse that doesn't have major memory issues, but has physical restrictions. And between the two of them, they're getting by. I mean, I see this, this seems almost the norm, is that we have a married couple, they've been together forever, they've adjusted, they've sort of, especially if it's like an Alzheimer's type dementia, it's happened over time, they've adjusted to this and they're getting by. And my advice in that situation is let's start transitioning. Let's start bringing in a caregiver, even if it's only for a few hours a week or something like that. Why? You say, well, wait a minute. You just told me two halves make a whole. They're getting by. Why do we need that? And there's a couple of reasons why I say it's important to start the process and start of at least, bringing in a caregiver every once in a while, things like that, is because twofold. Number one is, we know that the statistics tell us that the caregiving spouse dies first most of the time, and now we're not prepared for that. And secondly, to try to prevent the caregiver spouse from dying first, we need to get help to the healthy one, and I always try to make sure families understand this, that, okay, I get you're coming in and saying everything's fine now, and it may be fine, but I want to try to keep it that way. And one of the ways I think we can keep it that way is, all right, let's transition. This is one of the ones where I think we can start off with just a little bit of help and then kind of add as we go by and add as they get more comfortable with it.
Surprisingly, that's the funniest scenario, because that's what we do is when we go in, we're there for dad who has these, memory issues, but we actually end up being hired for mom to take care of the little stuff so she can continue to be the caregiver until she's comfortable with allowing us to start stepping in. And that's how most often we are introduced.
Yeah, that's great. I think that's a really important element there. So I do want to kind of address some of the topical, issues of dealing with the pandemic over the last couple of years, and even staffing and things like that. So talk to us a little bit about the adjustments that you've had to make as a home care agency in dealing with at the beginning when there was quarantine and everybody was shut down, and how that has transitioned to where we are now.
Well, there's not much we had experienced prior to the last 2 years. Now we think we pretty much know everything there is to know, because we do work in facility settings as well. So we ended up, that one of our clients lived in an assisted living when the pandemic started. So we adapted to their protocols. And it was interesting to see how things were handled differently on a home care basis and on a facility basis, because back to what we were saying, normally we see things from where we're at, not from where everybody else is. The biggest thing and the hardest thing, I was making notes, I was going over things in my head prior to this. The biggest thing we have seen is caregiver burnout.
Okay.
The demand for home care, especially, we've been in business for 20 years and we've never seen the demand like we have. Really, the first year, not as much, but this past year, calls every single day, because families that had a lot of people locked down when the pandemic hit, they were scared to let anybody come in for good reason. And the families took over and they did everything they absolutely could for as long as they could. And then, unfortunately, it seemed like the burnout hit everybody at once. It has been ever evolving. The staffing shortages have been unprecedented, especially with the level of demand, which has led us to actually partner with other home care agencies to ensure quality of care is there, because the demand is so high. And Bonnie would say it too. We tell people, the last 2 years, we've never said no as much as we have to people as far as being able to help them with their loved ones. And it's made our jobs here, in the administrative side, extremely difficult to hear struggling families and not be able to step in and help. So we've adapted and made those changes. We've made some great partnerships with other home care agencies. We've even co-staffed jobs together to ensure that if Aunt Mary wants to stay home, she gets to stay home.
Yeah, that's great. And I imagine that's a pretty big transition, because I suspect there's a good amount of competition in the home care field between businesses, and the fact that in order to meet the needs that you're partnering and cooperating with other companies, says a lot about those companies working together to meet the needs of the patients and clients.
Well, and finding other agencies that have the same beliefs too, as far as quality of care goes. And that's again, going back to when I was talking about who we are as an agency, our standards are exceptionally high, as they should be for home care agencies. And thankfully, we were able to find one main partner agency that we still talk to on a regular basis. And it's been nice to have somebody else in the industry to discuss the ever-changing protocols, because they're still evolving. I was just talking to a social worker today about, the current CDC guidelines and how that's, affecting, what they're saying is to come.
Absolutely. So actually, good transition there. We have we're going to do another podcast shortly on what the CDC and the Department of Health and Human Services calls the public health emergency. So as you know, and a lot of folks know, that there were special rules because of the public health emergency. And now we hear public health emergency is ending from an official standpoint, whether it is ending, depending on what happens with COVID and all of that. But from the special rules that we've had to follow, the public health emergency is going to be ending. And there's going to be a transition because now there's going to be going back to the old rules and how do we do redeterminations and how are we going to get back into the flow. And my understanding is we're supposed to get 60 days notice and that the Department of Health and Human Services will have about 14 months to get everybody back into the flow of things. So they'll have 12 to 14 months to get everybody redeterminations resubmitted, and there'll be a process. But I had a call with some other attorneys this morning that are in similar practice areas, and I'm this is not a good thing, but we were saying it's the Full Attorney Employment Act, because there's going to be a lot of disputes and there's going to be a lot of bumpiness in this transition out of the public health emergency.
Oh, yeah.
It's surprising. You would think that, all of the transition would have been at the beginning, and certainly there was quite a bit from a practical standpoint. From the law, they made it easier to qualify for certain benefits, and pretty quickly they did. So now they're taking those easy, determinations and some of the things that they let through before, and they're taking those back. And people that have been counting on this and getting these benefits are now going to probably need some advocacy and help to keep those benefits and make sure that they continue to get the care that they need.
Absolutely.
I don't know. So Savannah's here and she's been monitoring the questions. If there's any questions that we want to address, I just want to kind of give you fair warning as we adjust to some of the final questions here. But if we're ready for any questions, otherwise I got a couple more questions for you, Lisa.
Okay.
We don't have any questions now, so if you are listening and you have a question, just go ahead and put it in the chat and we'll be happy to give you an answer.
So Lisa, you described very artfully the transitions that you had to make as a company and providing the care. Is there light at the end of the tunnel? Is it getting any better from a staffing standpoint or anything, or is it still pretty much a struggle with staffing and those other issues?
So for us, we actually maintained our staff pretty well as far as our numbers at the beginning of the pandemic, the rise and fall. Because we are such a small family-owned company, we don't employ hundreds of people. But because, again, going back to the level of demand that there is, getting additional staffing is still proving to be difficult.
When this all started and ever since then, you've mentioned different ways that things that you've learned, and we had the same thing. We had to adjust very quickly, and I was surprised how quickly we went from pretty much seeing everybody face to face to doing a lot of things remotely immediately, and now having just that option. So that with there's some clients I've never been in the same room with because we can do Zoom and we can do telephone, and some I have employees now that work remotely and don't come into the office, but I still talk to them and see them every day. What types of adjustments that have you learned, and what we found is some of those adjustments we did out of necessity, actually we probably should have been doing the whole time, that they actually are efficient and good. What types of adjustments have you noticed for that transition?
So I thought that was an interesting question because we actually, we did not go remote at all. We actually started doing more one-on-one meetings with our staff and with our clients and with their families. And it's something that we plan on continuing because it has improved, one, our employee retention, because they feel more valued. We care about what's going on with them and make the time to make them a priority. And the same goes with our clients. So we actually took the alternate route. We didn't go remote. We just started limiting in their protocols. And that's back to, the ever-changing protocols. We've maintained a consistent set of protocols throughout the last 2 years that we still implement. We limit, number of people that, gathering in groups in our office, and same thing with clients. And we still operate under, proper PPE protocol as well.
That's really interesting. All the different things that you would, they say emergency is the mother of invention, or necessity is the mother of invention. So many things that we've learned, and yours is very interesting and unique to say, hey, it's more personal, more one-on-one. So that's really great. I think I have a couple of announcements I got to mention. If there's any other questions, we can put those into the chat. But one of the announcements is that we are conducting a class. So I both myself and Attorney Kelly King-Penner got certified to teach a class and offer continuing ed credits for social workers on dementia and Alzheimer's. And it's the prerequisite course to becoming a certified dementia practitioner. And we find this is a really interesting designation, not just from the standpoint of having that designation of a certified dementia practitioner, but really there's so many of the folks that we deal with that are dealing with dementia or Alzheimer's or some, form of memory loss, that having that extra awareness, being able to acknowledge that on your credentials to say that you have that you're a certified dementia practitioner can be really helpful, because what we've noticed is probably about 80% of our clients that we help with any long-term care matter have some memory loss or some memory issues. And so it's certainly a big area, and the more we can do to share information about it. We're doing an event, and we'll probably do it multiple times. But we're doing an event, since it's an 8-hour program, an 8-hour training, we broke it down into 2 different days, and you can go to our website to check it out and check out future trainings on this. But we're looking at it as a bit of a collaborative event. So both Kelly and I are certified to teach it, but we also will know that some of the people in the audience might have experience with certain issues that we don't have experience with. So we're hoping, since it's an 8-hour training, an 8-hour program, that we're going to be very collaborative and, hopefully share the experience of the attendees too. So looking forward to that. And anybody that still is interested in signing up for that, either this one or in a future one, certainly let us know. And we think that's going to be a real good program. It looks like there might be a question for us, Savannah.
Yes, that is correct. We have a question from Rams. The question is, I know that Medicare covers 100 days if someone goes to long-term care directly from the hospital, but what happens if they go home instead?
So great question. And Lisa, you probably could answer part of this question, but the answer on Medicare is, although in theory you could get up to 100 days where Medicare either pays for it or partially pays for it, very few people actually get their whole 100 days, even in rehab. However, to answer your specific question, you do have an opportunity if you go home, and I'm sure Lisa's probably helped with this at some point with some of our clients. If you go home and it turns out, hey, this isn't working very well, we really should have gone to rehab. I believe, and Lisa, you might be able to correct me on this, that we have about 30 days to make that decision. So there's a triggering event. Well, before COVID and after COVID, there was a triggering event that you had to spend 3 midnights in the hospital in order to qualify for that rehab. And so that triggering event works even if you go home, as long as you decide to go to the rehab within 30 days of leaving the hospital.
Correct.
As an aside, that was one of the rules that they got rid of during COVID, during the public health emergency, so that they got rid of that 3 midnight policy, that you could just be there for 1 midnight, or you didn't have to be there for 3 midnights to qualify. But as we see the public health emergency beginning to end, it will likely go back to that 3 midnight rule. But you have 30 days after you leave the hospital to arrange to be admitted to a rehab facility.
Mhm.
Any parting thoughts that you want to talk about, Lisa?
I don't think so.
What's
I
your
will
best-
actually be joining you on Tuesday for the dementia care
Excellent.
training, so that's exciting.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. And that's what I was hoping, that we'd have people that have a good amount of experience and kind of can share their experience on different topics. Lisa, why don't you share your contact information and how people can get a hold of you?
So the easiest way to get a hold of us is by our 24-hour line. It's 810-691-9749. All of our information is listed on our website as far as the different services we do provide, alternativeelderlycare.com. Again, my name is Lisa Church, and then Bonnie Kelly is the owner and founder, and my mom.
Well, thank you so much, Lisa. Really appreciate the conversation. We're going to be continuing this conversation with advice from your advocates. You can look for our articles that are in some of the local newspapers under advice from your advocates. We're hoping to just kind of spread the word about some of the things that we're dealing with and helping families and helping seniors. We will be addressing the issue of the end of the public health emergency and all the rules and regulations that might change and what that transition might look like. That will be coming up soon, so keep an eye out for that. And we expect to have be a little bit more prolific in creating these podcasts and webinars in the future. So if there's a topic that you feel should be covered, certainly let us know. If you feel that you'd be an interesting guest to have a chat with, then let us know, and we'll try to arrange for a advice from your advocates with you as the guest. So thank you very much for your time. We will continue the conversation.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.